For CDMOs, compliance is more than a requirement. It's a strategic differentiator. With ever-evolving global regulatory demands and the rising cost of missing that mark, readiness is shaping how sponsors choose, contract, and consolidate their CDMO partners. Today, we'll hear from Caitlin Minton-Smith, Senior Product Marketing Manager at MasterControl, and Gil Roth, President of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. They will explore 6 regulatory frameworks driving risk for CDMOs and show how digitally mature organizations are more than audit ready. They're better equipped to retain clients, scale operations, and grow their business in an increasingly competitive landscape. I'm your host, James Crosspayne with Pharmaceutical Online. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for attending today's event. This is live, so we do encourage your participation. I'll be holding a Q&A with Caitlin and Gil following their presentation, so please share your questions with us using the Q&A box on your screen. Even if we can't address them all, I'll pass along any we missed for follow-up after the event. This question box can connect you with me if you run into any trouble, but please try refreshing your browser first, as it will fix most common issues. Finally, today's event will be available on demand. You'll receive an email with a shareable link shortly after we conclude. Now, without further ado, let's begin today's presentation. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, James. It's really great to be here with everybody. As James mentioned, I am Caitlin Minton-Smith. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager for MasterControl, and I am focused on our manufacturing execution system. And I'm so excited to have with me here Gil Roth. Gil, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Sure. I'm Gil Roth. I'm the president of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association, or PBOA. It's a nonprofit trade group I founded in 2014 to advocate for the regulatory, legislative, and general business interests of the CMO and CDMO sector. So I could go on at length about that, but let's get back to the presentations.
Great. Thanks, Gil. All right, so here's what we'll be talking about today. As James mentioned, we're going to touch a little bit on the evolution of contract manufacturing and some of the regulatory expectations that have also been evolving. We'll unpack 6 major regulatory updates that are shaping how CMOs and CDMOs operate. And finally, we'll review how compliance can be more than a checklist. It can be really a part of your growth engine. To kick us off, I am going to pass it over to Gil to tell us a little bit about the evolution of contract manufacturing.
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, the CMO and CDMO sector really has evolved since the 1990s, when I first got involved with it as the founding editor at Contract Pharma magazine. And early on, it was largely driven by facility spin-outs or sell-offs by large pharma companies. New management would take over these sites, usually with a trailing supply agreement from the seller, and try to build their client base within specific dosage forms and geographies, often focusing on commercial manufacturing and lifecycle management for those clients. And over time, they started first building more greenfield facilities, and then, well, the D in CDMO really came to the fore, and that's contract development and manufacturing organizations. And these companies really started to develop greater expertise. They expanded their offerings and moved earlier into the R&D pipeline to assist their customers, especially startup and virtual biopharma, to move their molecules and compounds through the clinic and onto commercialization. And in the process, CDMOs became much more important to the biopharma ecosystem. Now, while their offerings became more sophisticated, they also had to develop more robust systems to be able to accommodate their clients' needs and ever-increasing regulatory demands. CDMOs are integral to drug development and manufacturing throughout the world, and given the breadth of their client bases, they have the opportunity to develop advanced manufacturing technologies and other novel ways of approaching manufacturing today, where individual drug companies that own the licenses, the clients of these CDMOs, may not have the same resources and experience to be able to do such. So that gives CDMOs an ability to push the cutting edge of technology, but that also brings more regulatory and compliance pressure. Now, Caitlin's going to walk us through some key regulations and the way digitalization can help CDMOs and their clients, and I'll try to provide some color based on my members' experiences.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gil. It's really interesting to kind of hear your perspective with your experience in the industry about some of this evolution. As a software provider, we do really focus on how are we meeting regulations and how are those helping our clients, like our CDMO and CMO clients. But what I wanted to do today is to just, like I said, kind of highlight 6 of these regulatory frameworks that we really see having a pretty big impact on CDMOs and CMOs. Some of these have recently been updated. Some of them were updated a couple years ago, and some of them, we just really like. So without further ado, let's dive in. To start us off, I'm going to highlight 21 CFR parts 210 and 211, which I like to call the backbone of CGMP. While the core requirements for 210 and 211 haven't changed, FDA did release draft guidance at the beginning of the year, and it really reflects the agency's evolving expectations for GMP, CGMP compliance, and includes things like the use of real-time monitoring, emphasis on in-process controls, and a preference for scientifically justified manufacturing strategies. This is marking a shift for FDA from passive documentation, or really a shift of requirements for contract manufacturers and manufacturers in general, from passive documentation to risk-managed digital quality oversight, and really is forming some expectations for manufacturers. First, really moving past this idea of checkbox compliance and into adopting full QMS practices, such as process validation, CAPA, and quality risk management. It's also really underscoring the need for manufacturers to be prepared for additional scrutiny of audit trails, access controls, and secure data handling, with more emphasis on those Alcoa Plus principles that we all know and love. And finally, it's really starting to show a prioritization of in-process monitoring and control in an effort to improve product quality and batch consistency. As you can imagine, with the updated guidance, it's no longer enough to simply have your processes in place. It's really about how those processes are executed and documented that matters more than ever. Some common pitfalls like transcription errors or incomplete documentation or inconsistent record keeping really conflict with the data integrity expectations that both clients and regulators have with things like real-time traceability, validated equipment source data, and kind of tamper-evident audit-ready documentation. To meet these needs, it's really critical that contract manufacturers can show and ensure that traceability, consistency, and inspection readiness in real time. And that's really where digital tools come in. Things like an MES or QMS or asset management system enable that continuous monitoring, the faster deviation handling, and really validated batch documentation that align more clearly with growing CGMP expectations. One of the things that I thought was really interesting as I was looking into some of these regulations is this growing trend of sponsors increasingly assessing your GMP system maturity when selecting their partners. And really the fact that they tend to see those with integrated digital capabilities as lower risk, audit resilient, and easier to qualify. We are going to stick with the GMP theme, but hop over to the proverbial other side of the pond, or if you are joining us from Europe, then I guess we are coming home. So we're going to turn to kind of the European side and talk a little bit about the revised Annex 1. So the updated EU GMP Annex 1 was fully effective in August 2023. So this is one of those that is not new, but is really important to highlight. And I really wanted to dive in and highlight some of the things to think about when it comes to Annex 1. And Annex 1 represents a really major shift in sterile manufacturing expectations. it expanded dramatically with the revision. It went from essentially a 16-page framework to nearly 60 pages of prescriptive, detailed guidance that reflects a more risk-based and systems-oriented approach. And while manufacturers are still adapting in numerous ways, it is actually already being used by sponsors as a qualification benchmark when evaluating partners. I wanted to highlight kind of three major shifts with Annex 1 that happened a couple years ago. So the first is that contamination control strategy is now mandatory, and it must show traceable risk mitigation across facility design, equipment, personnel, and procedures. The second thing I wanted to highlight is that barrier technologies and clean room controls are under heightened scrutiny, with real-time environmental monitoring and utility validation honestly kind of taking center stage. Finally, sponsor expectations in terms of what they want from a partner, especially in context of Annex 1, have really escalated. They are, things like CCS documentation and environmental controls are now frequent pre-audit discussion points when they are doing their qualifications. The implications for contract manufacturers with Annex 1 are pretty significant. Compliance now depends on connected systems that demonstrate control in real time. And I think the biggest thing that I see in Annex 1 is that this idea of fragmented or static processes are really no longer acceptable. This is driving a shift from procedural compliance, or, oh, we tick the box, to more design-based compliance, really requiring, in some cases, a redesign of your core systems, and sometimes investment in technology and infrastructure, which is a great segue into, what are some of those digital tools that can enable GMP compliance under Annex 1? Annex 1 makes it pretty clear that compliance in sterile manufacturing is not, like I was saying, just about procedures, just about ticking the box. It's about that system level integration. And manufacturers are expected to demonstrate control and traceability and responsiveness across all aspects of their operation. And that's really only possible when you have connected systems, and connected systems are really driven by digital transformation. So instead of working in isolated spreadsheets or static documents, digital tools really enable manufacturers to link data from all areas of the organization, whether it's clean room monitoring or training records or deviations or CAPAs, and really brings them into a single traceable framework. I think the contamination, it's a mouthful every time. The contamination control strategy, I think, here is a really good example. Under Annex 1, CCS needs to show how risk is managed across the facility. And when it's supported by a digital infrastructure, it really becomes a living system that enables manufacturers to pull in environmental data in real time. It links directly to deviation investigations, and it starts to really reflect the changes in your facility automatically and with full traceability. Some of the things that I think here are so interesting about using digital transformation is that it's really about unification, right? When we think about Annex 1. With the right tools, contract manufacturers can really align their manufacturing and quality under one cohesive strategy, and that ultimately or ideally leads to better outcomes and stronger confidence from sponsors. I did want to, Gil, kind of get your perspectives on this evolution of GMP globally, both with 210, 211, and Annex 1, and sort of what are you hearing in the market?
Thanks. One of the One of the interesting things to me about Annex 1 and seeing how it's rolled out, especially for members of ours who are operating in Europe or selling into Europe and being inspected by European or EMA inspectors, while barriers are preferred, as you mentioned, there's a focus on barrier technology. There's a degree to which it's, as you were saying in another context, it's not a checkbox. The fact that you have isolators does not mean you're Annex 1 compliant. We have a very significant sterile fill finish CDMO who still works with RABS systems, the restricted access barrier systems, who can satisfy Annex 1 for some of the reasons you're talking about. Their quality systems are that good, and they have that much integration in their system. They understand and can produce the documentation to show, we know we're not using the newest technology. We are compliant with Annex 1 because we're in control of our quality systems. And that's really I think the centerpiece for a lot of where GMP has been headed. You mentioned how quality management or quality maturity is a differentiator, or at least a selection criteria on the client side. That to me is where a lot of this is pushing. Certainly the update in GMPs, some of the new technologies that are put in place, and then the regulations on top. They're really meant to have CDMOs or in-house manufacturers be able to demonstrate that degree of consistency. And for a CDMO, there's the added challenge. We're always staying up on compliance trends and making sure systems accommodate a number of regulators' needs. But at the same time, some of the clients have different sets of demands, how they want to access that data, what format it should be in, how regularly they should be able to access it. And those are things that we have to work with as CDMOs that my members are always staying on top of. Number one being compliant, but then how do you do this in a way that also satisfies the client when it comes to being able to see what their process is like?
Yeah, thank you so much, Gil. I love that perspective of it's not just the manufacturer. It's not like in-house manufacturing where as a manufacturer, I only really have to satisfy my requirements. I think it's such a good point to highlight that that's one of those really unique structures of contract manufacturing is it's not just I as a manufacturer have to do this, but I also am now kind of beholden to various clientele. It's not just one client or two clients. A lot of the time it could be 100 clients and they could all have different different expectations or needs, producing different stuff. So thank you so much for bringing in that perspective because it is such an important
it's
thing
different
to highlight.
Yeah, and it's something that in-house doesn't always get. When they're trying to, we see it with quality agreements, for example, and it's been going on for decades within the CDMO space. FDA's recommendation is that the quality agreement originate from the CDMO side, but a lot of very large pharmas want it to be their quality agreement tailored for that particular facility, but originating with the client side. FDA kind of hates that, but they haven't put out guidance or anything to say definitively it should be the CDMO's quality agreement. But that's the sort of thing that can create, we'll say, discrepancies, or at least the perception of issues with quality at a CDMO if there's multiple quality agreements formatted in different ways across the spectrum for a single site. So really on the client side, being able to understand what the CDMO is and does, and that you're not their only customer is always important.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. All right, so we are going to stay in Europe, but move into medical device. Very exciting. So we're going to take a quick look at EU MDR or EU Medical Device Regulation. And the EU MDR has really introduced a really substantial compliance overhaul to kind of expectations and has really raised the bar for documentation and traceability and I'd say in particular post-market surveillance. For contract manufacturers who are supporting device or combination product manufacturing, I wanted to highlight a couple implications. So number one is really around your documentation. So documentation needs to be structured and complete and ready for the notified body review. And this really includes full traceability of your risk, your designs, and your production data. And with this has come a shift in sponsor expectations or client expectations that really sponsors now are increasingly expecting their partners to take a more active role in maintaining MDR compliance and supporting audit readiness. And I think actually what Gil was just talking about did a really good job of kind of underscoring that there's these very different expectations, and there's a very different kind of lay of the land that contract manufacturers have to navigate because they do work on behalf of a pharma company or a biotech or something like that. And what we're seeing is that even though Embed is still evolving, that a lot of sponsors are really already expecting their partners to manage those UDI records and post-market surveillance. So for contractors, it creates a lot of pressure to prove traceability across quality and manufacturing processes, to really actively manage supplier oversight and qualifications, and frankly, to respond faster to documentation and audit requests. At its core, MDR compliance is about managing complexity. So you are managing things like risk files to supplier audits to post-market data. And frankly, there's just a lot of moving parts that when you try to manage it manually, it can kind of start to show some cracks and some gaps. And to really power your MDR readiness, digital tools can play a heavy role in reducing complexity and improving your reliability. So I just wanted to highlight one tool that I'm quite familiar with, which is a quality management system. And with a quality management system, you can really automate your documentation workflows to ensure your SOPs, the UDIs and CAPAs are version controlled, searchable, and audit ready. You can start to really tie your risk management directly to production activities. So starting to link those design controls and non-conformities and PMS surveillance data to those production activities. And it really starts to centralize your supplier oversight. So it gives you a place where you can capture those qualifications, any audits or any CAPAs that have to do with those suppliers in one system. And that really starts to meet the MDR supplier governance expectations. I think a lot of people will point at these things and say, oh, great, faster audit prep or faster documentation availability. But it really is resulting, when you do embrace kind of that digital infrastructure, better visibility and consistency across your compliance activities. And that's really what you are trying to get to. That type of level of operational transparency can strengthen sponsor trust. It can reduce the perceived risk of outsourcing and can really start to position your organization as a reliable and audit-ready partner in Europe and in the European medical device landscape, because you can produce and show kind of all of these different pieces of information in a very organized and rapid fashion. I'm going to move from medical device and kind of go back to a more general regulation here, which is 21 CFR Part 11. I think everybody knows what this is. It has been around for decades. If you don't know what Part 11 is, you might be in the wrong business, but you do you. So it's been around for decades, but the enforcement expectations have actually evolved or matured to kind of harken back to what Gil was saying about the evolution of regulations. Originally, CFR Part 11 was really focused on electronic signatures and records. However, the draft guidance in 2024 started to reposition Part 11 as a broader measure of data governance and, frankly, digital trust. So for manufacturers, that means that Part 11 compliance is really kind of becoming table stakes in demonstrating your operational integrity beyond just electronic signatures. Current regulatory focus has really sharpened around 3 core expectations, which are all aimed at reinforcing that data integrity and that trust. So first, audit trails must be tamper evident and comprehensive. So regulators want to see that your systems can track who did what, when, and why, and they do not want any ambiguity or the opportunity for backdating. Second, access control and user authentication are really non-negotiable. It's not enough to just have a password policy. Regulators are looking for really robust safeguards to ensure that only authorized personnel can access or modify records, and that every action is traceable to an individual user. And the third expectation is really around system validation. So your platforms must be proven to perform reliably and consistency for their intended use. And I feel like that is always the statement that gets lost with FDA regulations, is for the intended use. So this includes things like documented testing, change control, and revalidation whenever those systems are updated. What this really translates to is increased scrutiny in a lot of places. So regulators are asking, can you prove that data hasn't been altered? Is your documentation consistent and time-stamped? Can your system stand up to validation? Or can your systems stand up to revalidation requirements? At its core, 21 CFR Part 11 is really ensuring that your digital systems are as trustworthy as paper. Paper is easy, paper you can lock away, paper you can control. And really what we're trying to do, or what regulators are trying to do with 21 CFR Part 11, is about making sure that those digital systems are as trustworthy as paper, and ideally more so. So the systems that you see here on the slide, QMS, MES, asset management, I think we all know that they serve very different functions, but they do all share a common goal, which is to generate, store, and manage records that are complete, accurate, secure, and readily retrievable. And that's what builds that trust with both regulators and with clients. The value of these systems and the value of digital transformation for 21 CFR Part 11 is really around compliance, but also competitiveness. So these types of systems enforce consistency. They standardize how data is captured, reviewed, and stored, and really reduce variability and the opportunity for human error. They ensure traceability. So things like audit trails and version control make it really easy to reconstruct events and prove that data integrity, again, that data integrity and that trust. And finally, they enable responsiveness. So whether it's during an inspection or an investigation or a client audit, they help you to rapidly locate the right records and be very confident in the information that you're displaying. And I think not only what you're displaying, but what you're not displaying, right? You want to deliver during an audit what the client or regulatory agency is asking for. You don't want to deliver them the entire binder of everything that they can start flipping through. I could probably talk about 21 CFR Part 11 forever because it's such like a cornerstone. But Gil, I really want to kind of hear your perspective in the market and from your members, just about kind of data integrity and what that means. It's not that it's not been important before, because obviously when it comes to life sciences, it is very important, but I would love to kind of hear your perspective on that.
Sure. And I'd say the definition of data integrity is what's been refined, and why that in that case it's become so much more important. I mean, every Wednesday I get the FDA's warning letters bulletin email. And if there's a CEDAR driven one for a drug product, you can be pretty sure there's going to be a data integrity citation, along with some of the other more colorful things that are found in some of these warning letters. But you're exactly right. Everything comes down to data. Now, I've been around the space since 1999. Digital signatures and records were, I mean, the internet was taking off at that point. The digitization of things was really taking off. And that really was a learning curve for some companies in terms of making that transition. But it's become ever more critical each year. All of that said, I will note that some of these companies, when we talk about having audit trails, single user passwords, et cetera, some companies use equipment that still runs on Windows 95. And I'm not just saying that's for CDMOs. There are companies that they have older products. They might not be in the US, for example, but those products are manufactured on equipment or using lab equipment that predates 21 CFR 11 in critical ways, where they might not be able to directly satisfy a lot of these data issues. So making sure that there are safeguards in place, that there are ways of trying to track this and translate these things into ultimately a secure system is really important. Another thing I'll point out that my members have cited since the COVID era with lockdowns, when a lot of inspections were put aside in lieu of records requests and then remote interactive evaluations, the ability to call things up digitally very quickly, to be able to produce what the inspectors were looking for, be able to get that stuff. And as you were saying, not the entire volume of information, but the very specific stuff they needed. Without this, that stuff becomes much more difficult. So we were able to meet the challenge, I think, as records requests and as RIEs took off. Now with more of a hybrid blend of in-person and more records requests taking place, a lot of CDMOs who have made the added investment in this space are really able to satisfy audits, both with the regulators and with their own customers.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. I'm so happy that
I dump a lot of things on you at once, but
no, I love it. I love just like the contextualization also with, the shared COVID kind of moment that globally we all experienced together. And, one thing I'm curious about actually while we're on that subject is just, do you feel like that shifted regulatory requirements and shifted just overall how regulatory agencies interacted and kind of have continued to interact?
It varies. There's some stuff that predated this. For example, the FDA's mutual recognition agreements with European inspectors, with the EMA. That already established, and that predated COVID, that established the ability to trust one regime's inspection reports and not have to send your own inspectors to everyone's facilities. And this was, again, mutual recognition. So EMA could call on FDA inspection reports for certain facilities, decide that, yeah, this is good enough for a pre-approval inspection, let's let this product through, and vice versa with FDA bringing in inspection reports from Europe, from European inspectors. They can be, the sites they're inspecting could be anywhere in the world. So in a sense, some of that groundwork was already laid just in terms of an inspector does not have to be in the facility necessarily. We can start looking more flexibly at this stuff. Then with COVID, I think we really saw an acceleration of that. With the use of digital technologies, we helped work with FDA and the other major trade associations. We all kind of sat down to try to figure out not just how those inspections will be done, but how the regulator would then feed back questions, because they wouldn't always tell us a remote records request was closed out. They would just ask for everything and never bother telling either the facility or the client company that they were done. So I think with COVID, we've seen some broader adoption of that sort of thing. Now, the usefulness of it varies. I'll say that one of FDA's assessments was that CEDAR saw significant value in the remote interactive evaluations and records requests, where the CBER side, the biologics end, felt that it wasn't as appropriate for some of the products they were assessing. So As a lot of things vary or are a big factor within the CDMO and overall pharma manufacturing landscape, it does depend on what you're making and where. Some of these really advanced technologies, you want to be in the site to make sure you understand what's actually taking place there, where other things you might have enough of a baseline of knowledge that a good amount of digital data will suffice when it comes to understanding an inspection need. If that answers your question.
No, it does. Sorry, I kind of threw that one at you out of left field. But no, I appreciate that perspective. So we are going to kind of continue on with our regulations here. We've got 2 more left, both really around quality management. So we're going to start with ISO 13485, which has long been the international benchmark for medical device quality systems. And it's interesting that you were just talking about global regulatory frameworks and some of the alignment that has existed for many years, because with ISO 13485, it's sort of becoming more important, actually, because of that alignment between those global regulatory frameworks. So recent updates and enforcement trends for 13485 reflect a growing demand for depth, traceability, and accountability across the entire product lifecycle. It's really starting to be expected that there is an element of lifecycle risk management. So a continuous process that spans from the initial design through manufacturing and into post-market surveillance. And regulators want to see how risks are identified, managed, and updated as those conditions change. There is also a clear push toward more robust documentation and objective evidence. And again, I think that it's interesting, Gil, what Gil was just saying, just about the different types of manufacturing and how different sort of accommodations can work differently. But we are noticing that this idea of documentation and objective evidence is really crucial. It's not enough to say a process is under control. You need to really be able to show it with traceable data and linked records and really structured documentation. And I think that this is sort of something we're seeing just globally with regulations is around climate and sustainability considerations, particularly in Europe. So whether it's energy use or material sourcing or environmental impact, kind of climate, sustainability, ESG are increasingly being discussed during audits and with clients during global partner reviews. So what we see, or what I guess I see from a software perspective, is that CDMOs and CMOs that start to embed those ISO principles into their quality systems, not just as like paper, but really in how the work is done, are better positioned, or tend to be better positioned, to kind of navigate those audits and adapt to future changes, regulatory changes, which we all know will never slow down, and start to really attract kind of global contracts. All that said, achieving ISO 13485 certification is really only part of the equation. And the real opportunity for contract manufacturers lies in operationalizing it across daily activities. So this really means that you are making quality and risk management part of the daily workflow. These are not isolated functions. You really start to embed quality into the entire product lifecycle, and this is where a digital infrastructure helps transform ISO requirements really into practice. I want to highlight 3 ways that this happens. Number 1, it drives alignment between teams. So you now have teams working from a shared source of truth, which can really help to reduce disconnects between design controls and process performance and post-market actions. Number 2, it makes quality processes much more adaptable. So when you can link and log risks in real time, you start to shift from periodic reviews into a world of continuous improvement, where you are updating controls and training as new information emerges and really allows your organization to stay super nimble and to stay up to date on what you need to stay up to date. And it starts to strengthen supplier oversight at scale. And what I mean by this is that with an integrated platform and really a digital infrastructure, it makes it easier to evaluate your supplier risk, to manage audits, to ensure corrective actions are tracked to closure, even across global or complex networks. And it really starts to shift the quality culture from reactive into proactive, leveraging digital systems. It starts to shift your culture from being really siloed to being really integrated and connected. And you start to shift from this idea of manual oversight into real-time assurance. So a little bit there on 13485, which leads me into 21 CFR 820, which is rapidly becoming QMSR. I will forever have to think about that when I say it. So kind of building on 13485, the FDA has now formally adopted into the US regulation, the FDA has now formally adopted 13485 into the US regulation via the Quality Management System Regulation, or QMSR. And it's yet another really good-sized overhaul, but it is really focused on aligning and starting to kind of bring together some of these frameworks so that you have more understanding and more continuity globally between regulatory agencies. I think the thing I want to really underscore is that this isn't just terminology. It's not that, oh, it's going from 21 CFR 820 to QMSR. It really is a structural shift in how the FDA expects quality to be managed across the product lifecycle. So we just talked about ISO 13485, and it really forms the baseline for QMSR and brings the United States into alignment with global standards. However, there is a layer of FDA specificity on top of it. It brings a stronger focus on, like I said, lifecycle-wide quality management. It expands the scope of audits with deeper scrutiny of how data is managed and how you're justifying decisions. It really starts to be the framework, along with ISO 13485, that all of your systems are going to be assessed by FDA. And these inspections are not just going to evaluate the documentation, oh, did you tick the box? But they're really going to evaluate your execution. So even for those contract manufacturers who are already, really compliant with 13485 and compliant with CFR 820, QMSR raises the bar and requires a level of granularity and proactivity and oversight that wasn't there previously. As you can imagine, the transition to QMSR kind of puts manufacturers at a bit of a crossroads. You have a decision to stick with basic compliance or use this as an opportunity to evolve into a more digitally driven and globally aligned partner. For a lot of CDMOs, they're choosing to embrace this and to really become that digitally driven partner. And they're doing it by strengthening how their quality system operates across 3 key dimensions. So number 1, they're embedding risk integration across the quality ecosystem. The CAPAs, the design controls, the supplier oversight, they aren't standalone processes. They're all connected through dynamic living risk assessments that guide decision-making as conditions change. Second, they're enabling digital traceability. This is a really big one. So every action is linked through version-controlled records and auditable data trails. And finally, they're building that inspection readiness, whether that's by a regulatory body or by a client, into the design of their systems. So instead of gathering those documents reactively and potentially giving them the full body of work, they can really show a complete, current, and connected picture of their operations and show the components that they want. This is really creating a system that's not just compliant with QMSR, but really future-proofed for new markets and new regulatory expectations and new challenges, because as we all know, we live in a world of ever-changing and evolving kind of circumstances. That wraps the regulatory portion of this, and I wanted to hand it over to Gil again, just to kind of give some perspective, because I know that regulatory expectations are really only part of the picture, but there's also kind of how those are being interpreted and applied in real world sponsor relationships. And Gil, I'd love to give you an opportunity to add anything, just around regulatory.
Sure, thanks. I'll say one of the big trends, and this comes from my years of working with FDA, advocating for CDMOs, and especially through the quality metrics and now quality management maturity phase that FDA is going through, is their repeated insistence that GMP isn't enough, that it's fine to be, you need to be compliant with all these things. You need, from a regulator's perspective, they love to see, compliance plus. And when it comes to the customer side, that's certainly, the differentiator, as we're talking about the things that will make you stand out as a CMO or CDMO when it comes to working with clients. FDA certainly pushing to incentivize quality. And just last week, I think they put out a white paper on quality management initiatives in the pharmaceutical industry and economic perspective. I haven't read all of it yet. Some of my members were, I won't say dismissive, but felt that some of the slides were a little too simplistic in terms of understanding investment and the quality return from there. But it does highlight the key question here, which is beyond compliance. What do the clients need or want, and what digital tools can help you fulfill that better? Clients are definitely seeking a lot of different paths to integrate with CDMO systems in order to understand current batch status, inventory levels, review e-batch paperwork, things like that. There's a lot more they can learn, but there's also a degree of too much knowledge, or at least too much access to information can be not so great. So having that balance when it comes to the client and CDMO relationship, when it comes to what digitization can do and where you kind of need to just step back from a client perspective. It's important to reach that balance. But I think there's a great deal more progress to be made, definitely. And it's exactly the words you used before, operationalizing this stuff. It's not just we have it in place or this is the overarching system, but this is how it permeates the entire function, the entire operation for a company throughout its daily work.
Thank you for adding that perspective and those points. Now that we've unpacked kind of what compliance requires, I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about what it enables, because for contract manufacturers, regulatory readiness doesn't just mean you're mitigating risk for yourself, but it can actually work to open doors. So I wanted to take a moment to explore how compliance maturity translates into real business value. So compliance can really move from a cost center to a commercial lever and become a bit of a deal maker. So the commercial reality is that today's sponsors are evaluating contract manufacturers through a compliance-first lens. And I think that we probably underscored that about 100 times in the past couple of slides. The standards like we've covered, like EU MDR, QMSR, Annex 1, et cetera, they're not just regulatory requirements, they're actually becoming market access criteria particularly in global markets where sponsors are screening for partners with things like clean inspection records and proven digital infrastructure and resilient quality systems. So what used to be back-end documentation is actually now starting to influence front-end business decisions. And contract manufacturers who continue to run manual processes are actually being viewed as higher risk, whereas those who are very digitally mature and can prove that out are really getting the lion's share of those contracts, or are at the very least ahead of their peers. It also helps contract manufacturers move faster and operate smarter, which in turn can improve sponsor confidence. So some of the tools like a QMS or MES that we talked about a little bit, they enable things like real-time execution, they automate decision-making, and they really bring a level of proactive oversight that is otherwise missing. More importantly, digitization really enables live visibility into environmental monitoring or training status or process expectations. And that is what is building that level, that confidence and long-term trust, is that kind of transparency. Finally, digital maturity becomes a strategic differentiator when it comes to compliance. So as Gil was talking about, it's not just enough to have the document. That's the baseline. You need it to be strategic. You need it to be scalable. You need it to be able to shift with shifting expectations. And compliance maturity is actually a new signal of operational depth. So they see, client or sponsors will look at modern infrastructures really as a marker of consistency and scalability and risk mitigation. Ultimately, kind of at the end of the day, contract manufacturers that invest in scalable digital-first systems, they not only are able to improve their regulatory position, but also, frankly, are pulling ahead of their peers. And this brings us to the role of technology, and specifically how platforms like MasterControl are helping contract manufacturers not only meet the evolving regulatory expectations, but turn compliance into that strategic advantage. At its core, MasterControl is built to support regulatory first operations. So that is whether you're managing quality events or equipment status or training or digital batch record. The platform is really built to bring these functions together in a single ecosystem so that you can work faster and stay audit ready and scale with confidence and do all those things like we've been talking about. I wanted to hand it back over to Gil for a moment before we dove into Q&A, because a conversation that we were having yesterday around integrated platforms and just this idea of kind of platform enablement, I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to give him an opportunity to share, since that's something that from a MasterControl side, we are really passionate about as well.
Thanks. I'll say it's an ongoing tension, certainly within the CDMO space. And, there's a bias when it comes to our membership, given that our companies tend to have more mature systems in place. So we're not working from paper at this point, but it's still that question of platform versus what I was talking about with the quality agreement issue. How much of this is driven by customers with a very specific way they want things reported and a very specific way of producing data. That can lead to use of third-party services that either overlap or intersect with what the platform is that one has set up. In a sense, we're running into this not from a client-side need when it comes to integrated platforms, but with FDA back in the 2020, when the CARES Act, the COVID Relief Act, was put forth, that included a reporting amounts requirement for every facility that produces APIs or drug product for the US market. FDA's criteria and formatting for how to report this information largely did not match anyone's operations. Everyone had okay, you want it in this format. None of us are reporting it in this format. We're really going to have to basically bring in people to be able to adjust and be able to do this stuff in a way that will just satisfy this FDA requirement, where we felt that if they push the reporting requirement to license holders instead of the CDMO facilities, they might get a more stable, more coherent form of the information, since those are the companies that are receiving all of this product before putting it out to market. But yeah, there are definitely the need for platform services, the needs for standardization. As I mentioned with quality agreements, it's a similar sort of vibe when it comes to how can we do this in a way that's going to make it easier for the CDMO to interact with a dozen customers or 50 customers with many different products. So this is the sort of stuff that I'd like to see advancing in this world. And again, I come in and since 1999, where LIMS was the big thing, those laboratory management services or systems, that was seeing how these things proliferate over time and how they become standards is really something that's critical to the CDMO sector, to the clients, and to the regulators.
Thank you both for that amazing presentation and a really thought-provoking discussion. We're approaching the end of the hour, but we have so many great questions coming through. Thank you to the audience for that. If you can give us a few extra moments of your time, we'll get through as many as we can. Any we aren't able to, I'll share with the presenters to follow up with you offline. And if you do need to leave, rest assured you will receive an on-demand version of the full presentation shortly after we conclude. Our first question comes from Raphael, who is asking, what major shifts have you seen in how sponsors are approaching outsourcing, and how has that changed the role of contract manufacturers?
Well, it's like I say, been 26 years, and I've seen it change in a very significant way. Early on, major pharma companies denied that they outsourced anything. When I was launching Contract Pharma magazine, I assumed all of these companies would be happy to talk about all the outsourcing they were doing. They all lied to me and pretended they did no outsourcing whatsoever, even though I'd visit a CMO and I would see a sign, welcome GSK or welcome Merck. Over time, the contribution that CDMOs made, both to large pharma and small, became material to those companies, and they had to be more straightforward just as far as financial disclosure went. And then they started discussing what some of their outsourcing practices were like, and that really helped raise the bar for not just major pharma being able to be more open about this stuff, but what some of those best practices are for outsourcing and how you can work better with particular types of companies depending on your dosage form, geography, et cetera. Now, as far as the changing role, I think there's areas particularly where the way CDMOs permit startups to develop their molecule and really move it forward changed the financial equation for a lot of these startup companies. In the past, they would just try to get to phase 1 and to phase 2, sell it to a major pharma, and that would be the end point for them. With the existence of CDMOs, especially boutique ones, they were able to move further along the R&D chain, get into phase 3, figure out, can we commercialize this ourselves? Can we become our own pharma company, or are we going to be the farm system for large pharma companies? So in that sense, they've sort of changed how drug development and commercialization go, because CDMOs, again, enabled this ability of startups to move along the chain farther. And that was tied also to some policy and regulatory changes that incentivized orphan and smaller population drugs, where someone who's just coming out of the gate with their first product does not have to have a gigantic manufacturing infrastructure in place. So we've seen more openness about talking about outsourcing, and we've seen a different role that CDMOs play when it comes to helping advance particular technologies and helping to advance orphan and smaller population drugs.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Our next question comes from Francis, who is asking, from your experience, what separates a good CDMO from a truly strategic partner, especially when it comes to quality and manufacturing options?
I will say I have a particular bias about this sort of question. Partner is a term that often comes from the client side. And in past years, and it's started to evolve somewhat, but in the past, Partner used to mean you, the CDMO, need to improve every year and reduce your costs. And that's not sustainable. Over time, and I'm talking more from the large pharma perspective of partnership, and I've been shouted at by large pharma companies for saying this, but I'll say it again. There's a degree that larger pharma gets more of why CDMOs need to be sustainable, why continuous improvement can take on many different faces. And really, in some respects, they learn that partnership means let's talk to the CDMO, not about this project, but about what's in our pipeline. Let's start opening the doors to them to let them see where things are coming from and what they can invest in as development and manufacturing solution providers to be able to help us move these projects along. When it comes to smaller and virtual pharma, they do tend to be much more, we'll say, partner-like with their CDMOs. They understand we don't have this infrastructure. The CDMO can do everything for us. We need to work well with them to do this. And, it's a very sticky world when it's that smaller scale and startup world where they're willing to stay with the CDMO all the way through the development pipeline.
Great. Thank you, Gil. Our next question comes from Sita, who is asking, how have regulatory expectations evolved, and what do you think sponsors often underestimate when it comes to compliance readiness?
I'll say more from, again, the smaller and startup companies, they tend not to know an awful lot. They know their molecule. They don't know chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, a CMC package that accompanies a drug submission. They don't know what different regions might want to be looking for or might look for when it comes to different types of manufacturing. There's a lot they need to be brought up to speed on. I'll say as far as regulatory expectations, we know that they're constantly refining. We know that new technology, AI, and everything else are accelerating what some of the expectations are, as we've seen, what sterile manufacturing can mean versus what it meant in the past, how GMPs have changed. I'd like to say we're seeing more harmonization, but it's another thing I've joked about for many years now. We've yet to settle on a spelling for harmonization, as this very presentation uses a Z or Z, and the Europeans use an S. So truly harmonizing is going to be an issue over time. That said, while we're seeing a raising of the bar, we're also seeing more recognition of inspection processes across different regulatory regimes. One of our member companies was the very first to do this. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. I think ICRA is it, the international inspection, where FDA and one other regulator had an inspector present at the site, but a half dozen other countries had inspectors remotely observing and interacting with the personnel and the on-site inspectors to try to get a multi-region inspection done at one time. Ultimately, down the line, you want other regions to accept a single country's inspection report and be able to get market clearance in multiple places. But this is another area where the technology is really advancing and changing the way inspections are done, which again leads to a change in regulatory expectations for sure.
Great. I think we have a question in a similar line from Hugo, who's noting that you've worked closely with large pharma and emerging companies. What do successful clients do differently when engaging with a partner?
This joke goes back 25 years when I was running Contract Pharma magazine. I used to say that I don't want to see another article that says communication is key to a win-win relationship. Every article that was submitted to me in those first couple of years included that. That said, communication is really important from the client side, whether that's large pharma or emerging mid-tier virtual. They need to talk to the CDMO and not treat them adversarially, not treat them like we're just a production slot for them. They need to better understand how the CDMO works, what its considerations are. They need to be realistic about what they're asking for, what timelines look like, what forecasts look like. For smaller companies, I would say get a consultant who can not only tell you what to look for with a CDMO, but how to slow your roll when you're asking for X, Y, and Z from the CDMO because you heard that's what they do at Merck or something. understand your scale and the role, the CDMO can play for you, be able to better work with them by understanding how they function and what you're bringing to them and what some of the realistic expectations are. Along the same lines, talk about bottlenecks, things that these are the milestones we expect to reach. Right now, the moment we're in, there are issues when it comes to the FDA personnel hiring and retention. That might impact drug review timelines. We've already seen a couple of complete response letters that have been issued to companies. What those mean for the drug filer, for the sponsor, is a delay in terms of when they were going to get approval. For the CDMO they're working with, that means the manufacturing you were expecting to do this month might have to get pushed off a couple of months, but you've got other people lined up for those other months. How do we all communicate better to make sure that those needs are going to be met, that we're not kicking somebody else out of production, and that we're able to accommodate what's, particularly in this moment, kind of an uncertain era? So.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice on what they can be doing now. I think the last question we have here focuses a little bit more on the future. Louise is asking, looking ahead, what do you think the next 5 to 10 years look like for CDMOs? And how can both sponsors and service providers be preparing now?
That's a real interesting question. I'll use interesting in that very ambiguous way. A lot of what I do is involved with policy advocacy. So I work with FDA, Congress, White House, and other bodies on those same veins in other countries. The focus on supply chain transparency, the focus, what we're seeing presently about onshoring in the US, but other countries also, how they're looking to develop manufacturing infrastructure here and in other regions, that's going to change the CDMO landscape. Who's out there, who's able to do what, how CDMOs are able to be more nimble in a lot of ways. One of the things I've brought up in some presentations recently, we've seen a lot of announcements from major pharma about 20, 30, 40, $50 billion investments, particularly in US operations. The workforce for that doesn't exist in the US. You can't just add all of that pharmaceutical capacity and not have personnel and have the personnel just mysteriously show up to be able to make all this stuff. So between workforce development and I think digitization and the advantages it can give in terms of automation and some of the other technologies we mentioned at the top of this presentation, can help alleviate if all those commitments come to fruition and all of this manufacturing capacity suddenly gets moved onshore in the next several years. What it's going to be like to be able to staff that, whether the large pharmas start investing more in technology to reduce their personnel footprint, or if they begin hiring CDMO personnel and the CDMOs need to figure out how to do essentially what they're doing with newer personnel and heavier use of technology going forward. So that's big. Advanced modalities, those things are going to change how CDMOs work, how some CDMOs work. We're going to see eventually more cell and gene therapies advance, and those things are going to change the healthcare ecosystem, what sorts of drugs they are, what sorts of cures they produce, how they're manufactured, and what the economics of those are is going to be big. ADCs, antibody drug conjugates, are also growing in importance now, and making sure the manufacturing infrastructure exists for all of the stages of that stuff. The high potency API, the monoclonal antibody, the conjugation, all that stuff is very heavy use of technology that CDMOs can play a big role in going forward. So those are a couple of my next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. That's a lot to look forward to. All right, everyone. That is all the time that we have. Oh, no, you're good. You're good. All right, everyone. That's all the time we have left for today. Don't worry if we didn't get to your question. I'm going to pass them along to our presenters to follow up offline. I'd like to thank Caitlin and Gil for sharing their expertise. And you, the audience, we appreciate you being with us here today. We hope to see you again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.